In 1984, the trajectory of German motorsport changed forever with the introduction of the Deutsche Produktionswagen Meisterschaft, or DPM, the championship that would go on to become DTM. The series started small, but over the next 10 years it would become a staple of the motorsport world, giving rise to some truly wild battles between some of the world's most famous drivers in touring cars that have gone on to become icons in their own right. From Michael Schumacher crashing the most 80s looking Mercedes you've ever seen, to the birth of the first ever BMW M3 and a classic Audi cheating scandal, this one has it all. Small piece of housekeeping, this video only covers DTM. Many of the cars and drivers mentioned competed in other championships as well, however to keep focus, non-DTM history has been left out unless specifically relevant. This video is structured to tell the stories of each car to have won the championship during the Group A era. You can use the chapters below to navigate to a specific car, or to skip a section you've already seen. Right, with that out the way, let's jump in. BMW were interested in the new championship, being one of Germany's biggest manufacturers and all that, and entered the series from the very beginning. They had been contesting the European Touring Car Championship in the early 80s with the 635 CSI, a Group A car based on the company's 3-litre straight-six powered two-door coupe. It was just the latest in a long line of BMW touring cars to contest the series, going all the way back to the BMW 2000. With the 3-litre CSL serving a long stint at the front of the field through the 70s. But by 1984 and the dawn of DPM, the 635 CSI was BMW's most modern and capable Group A machine. So that's what they used. With DPM being so new, it shouldn't be surprising that the reigning ETCC winning car would find success right off the bat. BMW's 635 CSI took the championship's first ever win in the hands of Volker Streichek. That said, it wasn't a walk in the park. Streichek hadn't actually won a single race, but consistency had proven more powerful than outright pace, and the stage was set for a new touring car battleground. Volvo were a mainstay in the European touring car scene in the early 80s, despite the name not necessarily being the first to come to mind when you think of sporty car brands. Nonetheless, the 240 had established itself as a solid bet, winning a round of the ETCC in 1984. The road-going 240 was about as Volvo's come, a sensible family car with the aerodynamic characteristics of a block of flats. Boxy as it is, I find the 240 in all its guises to be quite an attractive car personally. The weapon of choice for those wanting to race the seemingly docile Volvo was the 240 Turbo, which was based on the two-door coupe variant of the car. Powered by a turbocharged 2.1-litre inline-4, pushing around 340 horsepower, and with the car weighing just 1,065 kilograms, it should come as no surprise the thing had pace. Though it wasn't as, how should I say this, dynamically advanced as its competitors, but power can paper over many of those cracks. Heading into DPM's second season in 1985, Volvo 240 turbos would be run by a few teams, including the championship's only Swedish outfit, M&L Racing. It didn't take long for the Volvo to find a win, with Swede Per Sturesen claiming victory in round 2 at Wunstorf for IPS Racing. This was Stursen's only win in 1985, but the 240 went on to win again in the hands of fellow Swede Per Gunnar Andersson and twice in the hands of German Heinz Friedrich Peil. Despite Peil's 2 wins, and even more in spite of Klaus Ludwig's 4 victories behind the wheel of a Ford Sierra, it was Sturesen who claimed championship victory in 1985 with just a single win. His consistency throughout the season had allowed him to keep scoring strong points, and victories did not yield enough extra points for Stursen's win to be under any serious threat. The 240 though was verging on old tech. Would it stay competitive as DPM became DTM for 1986? Not exactly. The Rover SD1 was not a new car in 1986. It had first appeared for sale a decade earlier, and when launched, it was pretty widely praised. In fact, it won European Car of the Year in 1977, But in the years following, problems at British Leyland saw many of their models, including the SD1, pick up a slightly caution-inspiring reputation, exacerbated in the years since by certain British media properties. But despite the SD1 being old news by 1986, the new Vitesse was just that. New. Well, newer at least. It had been around for a couple of years, and at that time had seen some action as a Group A touring car with the help of passionate racing teams and the ever-ambitious Tom Walkinshaw racing outfit finding success in the UK, Australia and events across Europe, before finding its way into the hands of Kurt Team for the 1986 DTM Championship. Rover was surely over the moon that their fast executive car option had some proper racing credentials, and sticking it to their German rivals on their own turf would be the icing on the cake. Rover's approach, however, was markedly different to that of Volvo, Ford and Mercedes, opting to use a big, lumbering 3.5 litre V8 as opposed to the smaller, lighter 4-cylinders of their rivals. The exception to this, of course, was BMW's 3.5 litre inline-6 for the 635 CSI and the 3 litre inline-6 of the 325i, but they too were eyeing up a 4-pot for their next-generation Group A machine. Rover's V8 though was muscular, pushing just under 350 horsepower to the rear wheels, and with the turbocharged Fords facing some restrictions for their use of forced induction, the big V8 was still plenty competitive. It started out well for the one-car ATM Rover entry, with Team managing to win the year's opening round at Zolder before an accident on the first lap of round 2 immediately ended the high. The next few races were stronger, with Team finishing 2nd, 4th and 3rd through the middle of the season, maintaining those all-important points finishes. He then beat championship hopeful Volker Fiedler to victory at Wunstorf, bolstering Team's chances of Drivers' Championship glory. This, followed by a 3rd win of the season at the very next round, all but locked it in. Despite poor luck in the final 2 races, Kurt Team and his V8 Rover Vitesse had won DTM. But the days of plucky privateer entries taking the crown seem to be nearing their end as the series continue to grow. Today, BMW's M Division and the famous single-letter logo so ubiquitously glued to the back of 10-year-old 120Ds the world over has come to define the BMW brand. A single letter that stands for performance and driving pleasure, and the unfortunate cashing in on that cachet by the brand to sell ever less convincing performance variants of ugly, overweight finance fodder. Not to say that everything currently adorned with an M badge is unworthy, but its potency has surely been diluted by decades of badge marketing. But how did M become such a draw to begin with that BMW would feel the need to lean on its legacy to sell new cars? Well, the division has been around since 1972 and was responsible for BMW's racing machines from the 3-litre CSL onward, with the M1 appearing as the first M car in 1978. But the direction of M would change dramatically when they were tasked with replacing the ageing 635 CSI. Given that the Group A regulations DTM was governed by dictated that the competition cars had to be based on and not too far removed from a road-going counterpart of which at least 5,000 had been built, though with later variations this number decreased and evolution rules allowed for smaller numbers of follow-up models, etc, etc. BMW needed to select a base car that was capable of transforming into a monster on the track. They selected the 2-door E33 series that had first appeared for sale in 1982. It appeared a very savvy choice, with a sporty shape and not much mass, but there was a long way to go before the E30 could win races. The chassis was revised, the wheel track widened, aero tweaks made, and most consequential of all was the change in engine philosophy. The 635 had used a 3-litre inline-6, an engine BMW was known for. Inline-6 is still common in Beamers today. But the M3 would use a 4-cylinder instead. The 2.3-litre 4-banger was noticeably lighter than the straight 6 and could be positioned further back in the car for better weight distribution, and could even rev up to 9,000 RPM. In road car trim, the first generation M3 made around 200 horsepower, but tuned up for racing, it made around 100 horsepower more than that. Paired with a small, light body and a race-ready chassis, BMW Motorsport were ready to fight back. Lots of BMW's customer teams were keen to race with the new car, with the start of the 1987 DTM season seeing M3s in the hands of Alpina, Autohaus Volstadt Racing, Vogelsang Automobil and Zakspeed. The first two races of the season were strong for BMW, with Harald Gross winning the opening round at Hockenheim for Vogelsang Autos, and Mark Hessel winning round 2 for Zakspeed. Unfortunately for BMW, the next few rounds were totally controlled by Ford's Sierra XR4, which in the hands of Manuel Reuter and Frank Biela clearly appeared fit for a championship win. But Ford's run came to an end at Norrisring, when Olaf Mante took victory in an M3, with Hessel not far behind. The Sierra XR4 would take its last win at the Nürburgring, destined for replacement by the RS500 for the final few rounds, with BMW taking victory at Wunstorf and Diepholz, before Ford rounded out the season by winning in Salzburg with their new car. The back and forth between BMW and Ford had made for some great racing, and the championship could have gone many ways. But in the end, it went to Zakspeed driver Erik van der Poel in his M3. Despite the fact he hadn't won a single race, his consistency throughout the season was favoured by the points system, just like the last time they'd won. On a side note, BMW were also contesting some rounds of the World Rally Championship with the M3. Of course, on loose surfaces, the rear-wheel drive BMW wouldn't have stood a chance, but it showed strong pace on the tarmac, managing to win the 1987 Tour de Corse, stamping the M badge into yet another history book. BMW had created a monster. To celebrate the victory, they built a number of Evolution models, though confusingly these were not Group A Evolution Rule homologation cars. BMW were working on a much more serious Evo car for competing in DTM, with the celebratory machine dubbed the Evo I and the serious racing car dubbed the Evo II. Development of the Evo II was necessary to try and stay ahead of the ever-advancing Mercs and Fords. They made a number of tweaks, including lightening the flywheel and fiddling with the final drive ratio to eke out a slightly higher top speed. Some engine fettling resulted in around a 10% power gain. 501 road cars were built to tick off the Evolution homologation requirement, and it was game on for 1988. Well, nearly. In 1988, DTM's championship format was tweaked, moving from the traditional one race on a Sunday model to 2 races per weekend. While the races were relatively short, generally 55 minutes, the doubleheader format delivered the action, and the opportunity was often taken by drivers who felt they had been unfairly treated in the first race to quite immediately hash out their grudges on track. If you hear me reference the first race or the second race or both races, just remember each round hosted 2. Despite showing serious strength in 1987, the 1988 DTM season was unlikely to be a cakewalk for the BMW runners, who would have to wait until the latter half of the season to get their hands on the new Evolution car, which had only gone into production that March. Mercedes was no joke, and the Sierra RS500 had proven itself to be a formidable force in the few races it had contested at the end of the previous season. Unsurprisingly, therefore, the first 2 races at Zolder went the way of Klaus Ludwig at Ford. But in round 2 at Hockenheim, Christian Danner, racing for Alpina, took 2 wins, only making way for Kurt Thiem at the first race of round 3 at the Nürburgring, also driving an M3. Despite the strong start, the next couple of races made clear that Ford and Mercedes were the true powers on track in 1988. Even in spite of efforts by the governing body to slow down the turbocharged Ford using a restrictor plate. It didn't work. The Sierra RS500 was by far and away the fastest car on track. Roberto Ravaglia, driving for Schnitzer, who were new to the DTM fold, would score a double victory in Salzburg, though it must be said that victory in this instance is perhaps a stretch. Race 1 saw 3 starts, all of them calamitous, before it was eventually cancelled due to the mayhem. The following day, Race 2 got underway, only for so many cars to be taken out by on-track score settling that race 2 was cancelled. The remaining two events were more fighting between Ford and Mercedes, with BMW not troubling the top spot again. In the end, Klaus Ludwig took championship victory, deserved for both him and the mighty Sierra RS 500 that carried him there. The competition was heating up, and audiences were bigger than ever heading into 1989. Despite strong qualifying pace from the M3, it wouldn't be until the fourth race, race 2 at Hockenheim, that Johnny Cecotto would score BMW's first victory of the season for Team Schnitzer. But it was far from the last. Steve Soper, racing for Zakspeed, scored a double win at the Nürburgring, and a couple of races later, Roberto Ravaglia won the Saturday race at Avis. But the Mercedes cars were strong, as were Ford despite the restrictors and weight penalties. Every race was a fight. Soper and Cecotto would pick up an extra win each over the next 3 rounds, with Ravaglia remaining a consistent presence just behind the podium spots. By now, everyone knew that winning wasn't the only way to win. At Die Holz, Klaus Ludwig would take a double victory for Mercedes and repeated the feat at the next round too. The final round was controlled by Ford, but Ravaglia, helped by a second place finish in the final race, managed to secure the championship. Despite only having won 1 race out of the 22 race season, the scoresheet once again rewarded consistency over outright performance, and BMW's M3 proved the perfect tool for the job. Despite winning in DTM in 1989 and establishing that the M3 was a top contender in all things Group A, BMW were keen to stay ahead of the game heading into the 90s. To this end, development was underway on the M3 Evo III, better known as the Sport Evolution. The changes were the biggest made yet, with the engine bored out to 2.5 litres, more extreme aero parts including a larger splitter and rear wing, and a few other little adjustments to squeeze out every ounce of performance possible from the car. The result was even more power than the Evo II and theoretically better drivability too, but there was only one way to find out for sure if it was all worth it. DTM tinkered with the rule set going into 1990, banning turbos most notably. BMW and Mercedes were unaffected by this, but the Ford Sierra RS 500 and its turbocharged Cosworth engine were pretty much forced out by the change, and Ford weren't interested in trying to make it work. From BMW's perspective, this meant less competition, although there was going to be a new name entering the fray in the form of Audi. But they had a brand new car. Surely they weren't going to be a threat to BMW's Evo III. 1990 saw a mixed bag of results for the BMW runners, of which there was a few. Steve Soper racing for Bugatti and Johnny Cecotto racing for Schnitzer both had their moments early in the season, with Cecotto managing a standout double win at Mainz-Finten. But the story of the season was Hans Stuck, racing in a single-car Audi entry for SMS. Audi's V8 Quattro DTM car had shaken things up far more than had been expected, using a much larger engine, Quattro all-wheel drive, and winning despite the extra weight. Audi hadn't completely dominated the season though, and by the final round, Cecotto was still in contention for the championship. SMS wheeled out 2 extra Audis to help secure Stuck's championship, but in the end, it was an accident that made all the difference. Michael Schumacher, driving a Mercedes, spun Cecotto around at Hockenheim, handing championship victory to Stuck. This was pretty devastating for BMW, who had been iterating on the M3 for years and had just unleashed the very best version of it yet, only to be beaten by a brand new car that ran by itself for most of the season. With the same car for 1991, and the Audi only being at the beginning of its development curve, how confident could BMW reasonably have been of a resurgence? In the first round of 1991, resurgence looked on the cards, as Cecotto took a double victory at Zolder, and then Soper took a double victory in the second round at Hockenheim. If hopes had been shattered in 1990, they were surely creeping back after M3s took 4 consecutive wins. Unfortunately, the next couple of rounds were winless for all of the Beamer runners, with Klaus Ludwig picking up wins in his Mercedes and Stuck returning to the top step for Audi, and Frank Biela finding a win in his own Audi racing for AZR. Avis saw a win for Cecotto in race 2, and Wunstorf played out well too, as Cecotto's teammate Joe Winkelhock took a win in race 1 and Cecotto won the next day. But despite flashes of performance for the M3, it was clear that Audi's V8 Quattro was still too fast to beat. The M3 clearly still had winning potential, but that damn V8 Audi had really put a damper on their DTM efforts. Even without them, Mercedes would be serious enough, but without excessive further development, did BMW have a chance? Or was the M3 finally beginning to show its age? 1992 saw the disappearance of Opel, though the fact this is the first time I'm mentioning them so far should tell you everything you need to know about how impactful they've been in the championship up to this point. It was Mercedes that started on the front foot in 1992, despite engine upgrades bought by Audi. In fact, Audi spent the first couple of races struggling with reliability problems. Defending champion Frank Biela driving for AZR was disqualified from race 2 at Wunstorf for an illegal crankshaft. Audi didn't immediately drop out of the championship, but after a couple more races, they eventually did. They felt that the rules were being enforced unfairly. But with Audi out of the fight, the only real competitors left were BMW and Mercedes, and unfortunately for BMW, it was the three-pointed star that controlled the track. Winkelhock and Soper managed wins at Norrisring, and Cecotto, now racing for FINA's BMW entry, pulled off a double win at Brno, but then the next few rounds were once again a sea of Mercedes victories. BMW finished on a high note at least, with Roberto Ravaglia claiming a double win at the season's final round at Hockenheim, but it wasn't enough. BMW pulled factory support after 1992, focusing on a next-generation car. Just as well, as the M3s that remained in competition in private hands going into 1993 found themselves predictably losing to Alfa Romeo's crazy 155, which had been built to the new Class 1 specification. The Group A era was over. The 80s were a time of bold moves for Ford. The 70s and early 80s had seen racing success in Europe with the Escort and the Capri on sturdy surfaces and loose ones too, but automotive tech was moving fast, and with Ford Europe's rallying ambitions placed on the ill-fated RS200, they needed to assemble a world-beating car if they wanted to have a chance to carve out a place in Europe's crowded tin-top scene. In 1984, Ford's presence in DPM, the precursor to DTM, was in the hands of privateers running either Capris or the much more muscular Mustang GT. Rennsport fielded the Mustang, powered by a 5-litre V8, and in the hands of Manfred Trint, the car managed 4 wins across the championship's inaugural season. It was an impressive performance. However, thanks to a handful of DNFs, Trint's work was only good enough for 6th in the championship. But the stage was set, and Ford, seeing the success of a private outfit and keen to capitalise on the new championship, stepped in to show what they could really do. For 1985, Rennsport would be returning to DPM with their Mustang as an independent outfit, but would also be running 3 additional cars, 2 of which were in partnership with Ford themselves. The Blue Oval had become one of the earliest factory contestants in DPM. The additional cars weren't more Mustangs though, nor were they the Capris that had proven popular in 1984, no, they were Sierras. Specifically, they were Sierra XR4 Ti cars. Now, while the Sierra was a European car built in Germany by Ford Europe, the XR4 Ti was actually an American nameplate. See, in Europe, the top spec Sierra at the time was the XR4i, which used a naturally aspirated 2.8-litre V6. But Ford wanted to sell the car in the States as well, and the version that made it over the Atlantic ditched the V6 for a turbocharged inline-4. Strange that, it's usually the other way around. Anyway, the added T in the name stood for turbo, and that is the Sierra configuration Ford believed would be the best fit for DPM. Volker Strycek had won in 1984 driving a BMW 635 CSI. So going into 1985, it was pretty clear that BMW were Ford's greatest competition. The German marque had been in control of European touring car racing for years by this point. The first race drove this point home, with Harold Gross winning in a BMW, but round 2 saw victory for Swede Per Stursen, who was driving a Volvo 240. Klaus Niedzwitz won round 3 for Ford, proving their car at least had winning potential, but the competition was stiff. Despite Ford driver Klaus Ludwig taking victory in the last 4 races of the 1985 season, it was Stursen that took the Drivers' Championship in a Volvo 240, stumping both BMW and Ford in the championship's final year as DPM, as from 1986 it would be renamed to the Deutsche Tourenwagen Meisterschaft, or DTM. 1986 would see Ford, BMW and Volvo continue with the previous year's cars, but saw the first properly kitted out Mercedes outfit enter the fray too, in the form of Marco RSM, running a pair of Mercedes 190e 2.3 16s. The Sierra XR40i had proven quick, especially in the closing rounds of 1985, and so undoubtedly Ford were hoping to carry that momentum forward. To give the Sierra the best possible chance, they partnered with 2 more teams, with Sierras in the hands of the established Ford Rennsport outfit, as well as Ford Ringhausen and Ford Grab Motorsport. Despite the many Fords present, the opening round was won by Kurt Team in a Rover Vitesse. Then round 2 was won by a Volvo, round 3 by a Mercedes, and then a Mercedes won again in round 4 at Avers. Finally, round 5 saw a victory for Ford, with Niedzwitz winning for the Rennsport outfit, but with the next couple of rounds controlled once again by Team and his Rover, and with the Sierra only claiming 1 more win that year, it became clear that yet again, the Sierra XR40i just wasn't a championship winning machine. At least not in DTM. The 1986 championship went the way of Kurt Team, driving his V8 Rover Vitesse. While the XR40i had fought valiantly for the last couple of years, it was time for Ford to get serious if they wanted to win the now growing championship. BMW were ready to roll out their new M3, and Mercedes were moving kinda slow, but nonetheless, the time had come to replace the XR40i. The truth was that Ford's best effort had already been in the works for years at this point, with the Sierra RS Cosworth being unveiled at the Geneva Motor Show in 1985. But production delays meant that the 5,000 road cars required for DTM's Group A homologation rules weren't complete until December of 1986. The RS Cosworth, as the name suggested, boasted a Cosworth-tuned, turbocharged 2-litre inline 4-cylinder engine, as well as a whole host of assorted changes to make the car as sporty as reasonably possible. Except even that wasn't sporty enough for some, and almost immediately, work started on an even more sporty than reasonably possible version of the car named the RS500 Cosworth. The RS500 was shaping up to be an absolute beast, with a bigger turbo, bigger intercooler, better cooling, and all in all, much higher potential performance in racing trim. The only problem was that all of the above takes a significant amount of time, especially given they had to build 500 of the things, and so for 1987, at least initially, not much changed for the Ford runners in DTM. With the RS500 Cosworth still only on the horizon, Wolf Racing, Ford Ringhausen and Ford Grab were all relegated to continuing to use the XR40i going into 1987, but despite its age and proven deficit to rivals, Ford driver Manuel Reuter did manage to win at the Nürburgring in the car, and came second to Wolf Racing driver Frank Bieler, also in a Sierra, at the next race at Avers, before winning for a second time at Mainz-Vinten. There would be 3 more rounds before the RS500 Cosworth made its debut, but in that time, Klaus Ludwig managed to take a win in the old car too, this time at the Nürburgring GP circuit. If the XR40i could still hold its own, surely the next generation car would clean up. The RS500 was very powerful, much more so than its naturally aspirated rivals, but it was also heavy, and that slightly diluted the impact of their monstrous power. This wasn't Ford's fault though. In other championships, the RS500 ran 300 kilos lighter, but DTM had dished out weight penalties to turbocharged cars in order to try and keep the racing as close as possible. The RS500 first appeared with 2 rounds to go in 1987 at Deep Holtz. The best finish for the new car was a respectable third place in the hands of Reuter. He had, in fact, led the race briefly, but dropped down the order after being forced to take avoiding action due to an accident. At the final round of the 1987 season, Ford's new car would take its first victory, with Wolf Racing driver Armin Hahne winning in Salzburg and cementing Ford's place at the front of the DTM field, even in spite of the restrictions. Manuel Reuter had managed a close second in the championship overall, but the mighty M3 had delivered overall victory to Eric van der Poel. Ford would have to set their sights on 1988 instead. In 1988, DTM's championship format was tweaked, moving from the traditional one race on a Sunday model to 2 races per weekend. While the races were relatively short, generally 55 minutes, the doubleheader format delivered the action, and the opportunity was often taken by drivers who felt they had been unfairly treated in the first race to quite immediately hash out their grudges on track. If you hear me reference the first race or the second race or both races, just remember each round hosted 2. Round 1 at Zolder saw Ford driver Klaus Ludwig take a double victory, both times finishing ahead of another RS500 in second. Ford's car was already so clearly dominant that after just the first round of the season, discussions were already underway behind the scenes on how best to slow the Sierras down, so as to give other manufacturers even a semblance of a chance to fight with Ford. Balance of Performance Regulations, or BOP, were then, are now, and will always be controversial. Any explicit action taken to slow down a car will be viewed with scrutiny, and oftentimes allegations of double standards or straight-up persecution will begin to proliferate in circles supportive of the affected teams. It's important to remember that DTM's stated goal was not to have the fairest racing, but the most entertaining racing, and they don't always line up. That said, I do have problems with DTM's handling of Ford's speed, but we'll get to that soon. The upshot of these talks was that from round 2, the Sierra RS500s would be forced to run a narrower restrictor plate, limiting the amount of air the engine could intake and reducing the power output in an attempt to peg them back. This appeared to have worked, as in round 2 at Hockenheim, the highest finish for a Ford in both races was 6th in the hands of Klaus Niedzwiez. Unsurprisingly, Ford were not happy about the BOP action taken against them, especially given that they were already running substantially heavier, but they persevered nonetheless. Ludwig clawed his way back to 2nd place in the first race at the Nürburgring before slipping back to 5th again in round 2. Round 4 at Brno saw the RS500 take its first win since the new restrictors had been put in place. Wolf Racing driver Hahne took a decisive victory in the first race, and despite being unable to repeat the feat in race 2, a 2nd place for Ludwig affirmed that Ford were still in the fight. The next few races saw Mercedes and BMW trading blows, with the once mighty Sierra taking a conspicuous back seat until round 7 at the combined Nürburgring Nordschleife and GP circuit, where Hahne won again for Wolf Racing. That first race hadn't been all good news for the Sierra runners though, as Niedzwiez had a massive accident at high speed on his 3rd lap of the Green Hell. Thankfully, he only suffered a broken arm, and not much worse, but it was a scary crash. Hahne went on to win the 2nd race that weekend as well, marking the first double victory for any of the Sierra drivers since Ludwig's dominant opening round. Hahne then managed his 3rd win in a row in the first race of round 8 at the Norris Ring before Ludwig reclaimed the top step in race 2. Despite their restrictor-induced collapse in performance from round 2 onwards, by this point in the season the Ford runners had managed to make back most of the ground they had lost, and were once again a serious threat in the competition. But would they be allowed to race in peace? Ludwig stormed to his 2nd double victory of the year at Wunstorf, with Ford Ringhausen driver Steve Soper finishing 2nd in both races too, ahead of Frank Biela, also in a Sierra, also in both races. The RS500 had locked out the podium in both races at Wunstorf, and alarm bells were beginning to ring again for the championship's penalty-frenzied regulators. The Sierra's restrictors would be narrowed by 2mm. The following event was in Salzburg. Roberto Ravaglia, driving for Schnitzer BMW, scored a double victory in Salzburg on paper. Though victory in this instance is not just a stretch, but a complete contortion of the truth. Race 1 saw 3 starts, all of them calamitous, before it was eventually cancelled due to the mayhem. Then, when Race 2 got underway, so many cars were taken out by on-track score settling that Race 2 was cancelled. The whole weekend was an embarrassment for the championship, but the show must go on, and the circus moved to Hungary, where DTM would race for the first time on the Hungaroring. Ford and BMW had neglected to perform any testing on the circuit before rocking up to the event. Mercedes, however, had. And, perhaps unsurprisingly, Mercedes driver Johnny Cecotto pulled off a double win. Though, in fairness, Sierras were not very far behind. The final round of the 1988 season was hosted at Hockenheim, and heading into the final race, Klaus Ludwig was the favourite for the championship. Armin Hanna managed a momentous double win for Wolf Racing, adding to his impressive tally, but despite being off the pace, Ludwig had done enough to win the championship with 16 points to spare. Ford had built a rocket ship, and despite weight penalties and punitive restrictors, the Sierra RS 500 Cosworth had taken on DTM and come out victorious. Ford didn't have much room to manoeuvre going into 1989. Hamstrung by penalties, and to add salt to the wound, championship-winning driver Klaus Ludwig defected to Mercedes AMG. Development was effectively made redundant, as the car wasn't able to operate at its full potential anyway, so with Ford held in place and rivals free to develop around them, 1989 was going to be a tough year for the Ford runners, even off the back of a successful 88 campaign. This proved true immediately. It was clear from the get-go 1989 would be a fight between BMW and Mercedes, with the RS 500 not managing a win until race 2 at Avis, 5 rounds into the season. This was followed up by an impressive double win at the Nordschleife for Alain Ferté for Wolf Racing's Ford outfit, who won again in race 2 at Norrisring. With another Ford victory at Hockenheim race 2, maybe the RS 500 wasn't down and out just yet. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough, and despite a double win for Niedzwiecz at the final round, the championship went the way of Roberto Ravaglia and his BMW M3. Niedzwiecz had come a reasonably close second in the drivers' standings, but at least in DTM, the Sierra RS 500 would never see its chance to climb back to the top. It had been announced that from 1991, the championship would ban turbos altogether. The only factory effort this affected was Ford's, and with the prospect of another dead year under the heel of rulemakers before facing a locked-in ban anyway, Ford pulled the plug on their DTM effort after 1989. I think it's pretty clear that Ford was a victim of particularly punitive enforcement during and after their mightily successful 1988 campaign. And while those initial penalties could be justified by the existing rule set and the guiding principles of the competition, the decision to ban turbos and effectively force Ford out of the competition in a break from the established norms of Group A racing seemed too pointed to be an unfortunate coincidence. Ford was the only factory team affected. It also doesn't make sense from the perspective of trying to put on the best possible show. Surely you would want to keep competitors who are willing and able to invest and fight for wins. I can't claim to understand the motivations, but to me, I think Ford deserved a fairer shake in DTM. The 80s were a wild time for Audi. The development of their Quattro four-wheel drive system had helped them claim 2 WRC titles during Rally's outrageous Group B era. But after Group B's collapse in 1986, Audi were left with a lot of great knowledge and tech, but no challenge. Initially they tried their hand at Group A Rally, Group B's safer, tamer follow-up, but the Audi 200 just wasn't really a great rally car. They then settled their focus on North American road racing, where Audi could really stretch their legs, briefly. The 1988 Trans Am and 1989 IMSA entries scared the competition so much that the rules were changed in both championships to force Audi out, or at least slow them down. That's a story I've told before. So they looked back towards home. The Deutsche Tourenwagen Meisterschaft had been Germany's premier touring car series since 1984. But Audi, undeniably one of the country's biggest motorsport names by this point, had been conspicuously absent from the competition, focusing much more on their aforementioned rally and North American endeavours. If their record in WRC, Trans Am and IMSA were anything to go by, DTM's big teams were in for a shock. DTM was using modified Group A rules though, which forced competing cars to be relatively closely related to a road-going counterpart, of which at least a few hundred had been built. Similar rules to those Audi's 200 rally car had disappointed under in WRC. Unfortunately though, they actually weren't similar enough for Audi, as DTM strayed from the established Group A rules by banning turbos after 1989. This punished Ford's very successful Sierra RS 500 and prevented Audi from using their beloved turbocharged 2.1-litre inline 5 that had brought them so much glory. If Audi were going to have a chance of beating the entrenched DTM forces of BMW and Mercedes, they were going to need to rethink their strategy. Step 1 was to work out which of their road cars would make the best touring car. This step mattered because unlike Group B and IMSA, their racing car would need to remain mechanically similar to whichever car they decided to use, including the engine. Race cars usually aim to be light, nimble, powerful and precise. And with that in mind, Audi, a very experienced motorsport brand, decided to go racing with this absolute barge. Introduced in 1988, the Audi V8 was the company's flagship executive saloon, filling the spot in their lineup occupied today by the A8. I like the A8. It wouldn't be my first choice for a hot lap. Nevertheless, turning 3-box executive saloons into rocket ships on the track was something Audi had made good on in North America, so perhaps it wasn't as mad as it seemed. The V8 was, as Audi is known for, basically just a bigger and better equipped version of the Audi 80 and 100. But of course, as the name betrayed, it had a naturally aspirated V8 under the bonnet, which in a championship now without turbos could make all the difference against their predominantly 4-cylinder rivals. The V8 from the road car was tuned up, with its first incarnation producing just under 420 horsepower, significantly more than the approximately 330 horsepower produced by BMW and Mercedes inline 4s. This power wasn't pure advantage though. As Audi's signature technology, they retained the Quattro 4-wheel drive system, making the car overweight by around 200 kilograms. They had slimmed the yacht down, but not all the way. The bet was that 4-wheel drive would prove to be as consequential an advantage as it had been across the Atlantic. One team was running Audis, Schmidt Motorsport, or SMS, with drivers Hans Stuck, Walter Roll and Frank Jelinski. Round 1 was hosted at Zolder, where SMS's single car entry in the hands of Stuck was hit from behind in the opening stages of race 1, being forced early to the pits, which compromised his race. He recovered to 14th place, but it was not the start they'd wanted, especially given only the top 10 finishers received points. Race 2 was much better for Stuck, who managed a podium finish behind 2 of AMG's 190e Evo cars. The next couple of events were more of the same, with a second place finish at the second race in Hockenheim and a Nürburgring weekend compromised by an accident. But then SMS turned a corner. In round 4, Hans Stuck took victory in both races at Avis, beating the strong BMW team twice in a row. Audi had finally arrived. Round 5 was a write-off, but Stuck went back to his winning ways in Wunstorf, winning both races yet again. The rest of the season was more of a mixed bag, with weekends seeing wild swings in performance. Stuck did manage to win race 1 at Norrisring and later race 2 on the Nürburgring GP circuit. In the final round, SMS took the pressure off Stuck a touch by adding 2 extra cars, driven by Roll and Jelinski. They locked out the podium, not just once, but in both races that weekend, denying the very best of BMW and Mercedes any trophies for their efforts. The final race had seen disaster for championship contender Johnny Cecotto driving for BMW, who was spun around by none other than Michael Schumacher, handing championship victory to SMS driver Hans Stuck, who had competed alone for the majority of the season with an unproven car, only to take championship victory. This was a huge win for Audi, who are now masters of motorsport disruption. The sky was the limit. During the 1990 season, though I can't pinpoint exactly when, Audi fiddled with the engine and pushed the car from just under 420 horsepower to around 460. If that wasn't enough, they took advantage of the Evo rules, bolting on a new splitter and a ducktail spoiler for a bit of extra downforce. If Audi hadn't put on a strong enough showing the year before, a full season, multi-car entry where all the cars had 10% more power and extra downforce was almost overkill. BMW and Mercedes barely changed their cars at all from the end of 1990. In addition, SMS were no longer the only team running the V8 Quattro, with Audi Zentrum Reutlingen, or AZR for short, joining the fray with drivers Frank Biela and Hubert Haupt, while SMS retained defending champion Hans Stuck and Frank Jelinski. The opening round saw BMW come out swinging, with Cecotto winning both races at Zolder, while Audis managed second and third in the second race. The next round was more of the same, with all four Audis appearing to be somewhat in no man's land, until Avers, where they finished top 4 in race 1, the best of which was Stuck, before taking the top 3 finishing spots in race 2, this time with AZR driver Frank Biela taking the checkered flag first. Only a fire for the second AZR car prevented a second front 4 lockout in a row. After this dominant showing, all the Audis tumbled back down the order at Wunstorf before Stuck took another win at Norris Ring Race 2. The sudden swings in Audi's performance race to race gave rise to the sandbagging theories, whereby Audi wasn't racing to be the fastest, but playing a longer game, avoiding weight penalties and playing as a team. They certainly seemed to have the right car to secure the wins when needed, though motorsport can never really be such an exact science. Stuck won again in race 1 at Defaults and again in race 2 at Singen, where race 1 had been won by Biela, who then opened the taps and showed what the V8 could really do in the final 2 races at Hockenheim, which he won convincingly. If the sandbagging theory sounds outlandish to you, know that both those races saw Audi emerge from the mid-pack to take full podium sweeps at both races that weekend. Take that as you will. Regardless of Audi's methods, they had played DTM like a fiddle, securing AZR driver Frank Biela championship victory, Audi's second in a row. Audi showed up in 1992 with a car that looked very similar to the previous year, but made slightly more power, now around 470 horsepower, but sounded different somehow. Nonetheless, the season got underway and started out not so great for two-time champions Audi. Biela managed a podium at the first race, but in the second, all 4 Audis retired with some sort of mechanical failure. 3 of them were engine-related. What had Audi been up to? They were back on form in round 2 at the Nürburgring, with Biela claiming victory, followed closely by Stuck and Jelinski in a wet first race, before they all tumbled unceremoniously down the order during the much drier second race on Sunday. Four-wheel drive was a much bigger advantage with lower grip levels. At the next round in Wunstorf, the sand started to shift under Audi's feet, and we begin to understand what's been happening behind the scenes. Defending champion Frank Biela driving for AZR was disqualified from race 2 at Wunstorf for an illegal crankshaft. The previous year's Audi, and crucially the V8 Quattro road car, had a 90-degree cross-plane crank. Biela's car had a 180-degree flat-plane crank. Audi insisted that the crankshaft was legal, as it wasn't a new component, but rather a modified one that they had reshaped. It seems this line of defence had held when the change was initially questioned earlier in the season, but after protests and re-examination, it was deemed to be too far removed from the homologated spec and was declared illegal. The team plodded on for a couple of rounds, presumably reverting to the previous year's engine, before throwing in the towel halfway through the season. Audi felt the decision had been unfair and that they'd been singled out by rulemakers. For all their many successes, Audi sure were sore losers. By this point though, the V8 Quattro had grown even more overweight compared to its competitors, nearly 350 kilograms by 1992, and their decisive advantage had clearly been eroded. Audi were there for a good time, not a long time, and once they started coming down, they just packed up and went home. Just as quickly as it had entered the sport, the V8 Quattro DTM vanished, making way for a resurgent Mercedes, who found success just before the championship tipped into its next evolution. Mercedes in the 1980s had a pretty good idea of what their cars should be. Well-built, dependable, comfortable cars presented as a convertible, saloon, estate, or maybe even a coupe if you're feeling adventurous. They weren't boring exactly, but not many people had their pants set alight by the W126 S-Class despite its excellence. And oh yeah, they also made this. This is the story of the Mercedes 190e 2.5 16 Evo II. So that car looks mad, right? But how did sensible Mercedes go from making this to this? Well, it starts with one of the company's best known platforms, the W201. W201 was Mercedes' internal code for the platform that would go on to form the basis of the 190 series of cars. It was famously over-engineered, with Mercedes claiming to have spent £600 million developing the platform, an investment that the company itself admits was probably somewhat superfluous. However, it resulted in one of the automotive world's strongest and best loved platforms. Development took place throughout the late 70s and into the early 80s, and by 1982 they were ready to put their new, smaller sedan into production. I could tell you all the little details and different variations of the 190 that Mercedes made over its more than 10 years in production, but I know why you're here, so let's talk about racing. Clearly, there were some people at Mercedes who were bored by the 190 too, so in 1983, the sporty, Cosworth-tuned 190e 2.3 16V was unveiled at the Geneva Motor Show. As the lengthy and rather digit-heavy name would suggest, the car now had a 16-valve 2.3-litre inline-4, which, with the extra Cosworth bits, made around 186 horsepower. This was about 50 horsepower or so more than the standard car, and this wasn't just for the sake of it. The appetite for racing these cars was strong. The 190e 2.3 16V with its pokey Cosworth engine was all the encouragement a small team at AMG needed to go out in search of racing glory. The Deutsche Tourenwagen-Meisterschaft had stoked the German sporting spirit, drawing in teams and manufacturers from far and wide to fight it out on track and prove who really made the best cars. By the mid-80s, it looked on track to become more than just a little regional series. Mercedes had been eyeing up DTM for a while, and they knew that an 8-valve 2.3-litre engine wasn't going to cut the mustard against their rivals, especially as the competition progressed. The Cosworth partnership was an effort to put a strong performance engine into series production, therefore homologating it for use in DTM. AMG were asked to work their magic and partnered with Marco RSM, the personal racing team of Helmut Marko, a name you'll certainly recognise if you follow Formula 1, to turn the new sportiest available version of the 190e into a serious race car, capable of serious results.
Then they gave it a name, the Mercedes-Benz 2.3 16. And the rest is performance history, or soon will be.
The 2.3-litre Cosworth inline-4 wasn't bad by any means, but in road car trim it only produced around 186 horsepower. With a tune-up and some racing-specific parts, as well as racing modifications to the rest of the car, the 190e 2.316V was ready to be let out onto the track. First competing in 1986, the 190e quickly proved to be a competitive machine, with Marco RSM driver Volker Wiedler claiming a race win at the Nürburgring in round 3, ahead of championship leader Kurt Thieme and his V8 Rover Vitesse. This was followed by a second win for Wiedler at Avis, and despite not winning another race that year, of the remaining 5 rounds, Wiedler managed second place in 3 of them, securing second place in the championship overall behind Thieme. For a debut season, Mercedes had knocked it out the park. For 1987, the hope was to carry that momentum forward and ideally achieve even better results. Unfortunately, fate had other ideas. Marco RSM entered 3 190e 2.3s into DTM, however, the best finish any of them could manage was 3rd place in the opening round. It was downhill from there, with the highest championship finish being 9th place for Jörg van Ommen. Mercedes had been roundly beaten by both BMW and Ford. Something needed to change. A number of teams campaigned the 190e 2.3 in DTM, including BMK Motorsport, Jet Racing, Snowbeck Racing, AMG, and of course Marco RSM for the 3rd time. However, the results weren't flooding in. A couple of podiums in the first few races were appreciated, before the second race at the Nürburgring in round 3 saw a victory for Danny Snowbeck in a 190e 2.316, who then won again at the following event, again in the second race in Czechoslovakia. This was already pretty good, but was followed by a double win for AMG's Johnny Cecotto at Avis. Then the Ford Sierra RS 500 set about destroying the next few races, with only BMW seemingly able to hold a candle to them, and even that was only after Ford was dished out an intake restrictor to slow their beast down. There was one last hurrah for Mercedes in 1988 though, as Cecotto took another double win at the Hungaroring, taking advantage of the fact Ford and BMW had neglected to properly scope out the new track. Despite the strong performance from Cecotto, Klaus Ludwig and the almighty Sierra reigned supreme that year. But behind the scenes, the wheels were turning at Mercedes. They had come so close to success and were determined to prove that the 3-pointed star was worthy of gold. The 2.3-litre engine just wasn't providing the punch Mercedes needed to take the fight to BMW's M3 and Ford's scary Sierra, even with the latter's restrictions. And so for the next generation, the engine would instead be 2.5 litres. In road car trim, the new engine was pushing 197 horsepower, a number everyone knew was far less than what it would be capable of on the track. The new 2.5 litre engine had replaced the old 2.3 litre unit by the end of 1988, but it was only the first step. In March of 1989, Mercedes unveiled their grand plan. Shown at the Geneva Motor Show, the car was clearly a 190e, but it had some not so subtle changes. It of course boasted the new 2.5 litre engine, but it also had wider wheel arches and a new rear wing. Keener onlookers who took a look inside the car may have spotted a switch in the cabin used to control the ride height, revealing significant upgrades to the suspension setup, and they had also upgraded the brakes. The car was the 190e Evolution, and with 502 road-going versions manufactured, it was time to race. The car hadn't been ready for competition from the start of the season, meaning that the handful of Mercedes teams, including AMG themselves, would have to start the year with the old spec car. Klaus Ludwig, who AMG had poached from Ford to capitalise on his championship-winning form, had managed to pick up a race win at Hockenheim for AMG in the old car, but early in the season that's about as good as the news got for the Mercedes runners, until the Evo was unleashed in round 4. Roland Asch won the round's first race in the new car for Jet Racing, before Kurt Thieme won the second race with the old car. It's good to know the new car had winning potential, but losing to the machine that it was supposed to replace was perhaps a shaky start. The next couple of races weren't much to write home about for any of the Mercs, until Kurt Thieme, now also behind the wheel of new Mercedes machinery, took victory at the first Norrisring race. At defaults, the Evo really showed what it could do, with Ludwig claiming a double victory at the event before claiming a second double victory in a row at the next round hosted at the Nürburgring. The Mercedes had finally come into its own. Despite the strong form late in the season, however, Ludwig only claimed enough points for 11th place in the championship, with the best performing Mercedes driver being Kurt Thiem, who managed 4th in the championship. He was rewarded for his consistency. For Mercedes, this simply wasn't good enough. They needed to do better. They needed to win. Before the 1989 championship had even ended, Mercedes was toiling away on the Evo II. Unveiled at the 1990 Geneva Motor Show, exactly 1 year after its predecessor, the Evo II was everything bold about the Evo I, taken to the extreme. The engine produced 15% more power, the body kit, designed by Richard Epler at the University of Stuttgart, had gotten wider and more aggressive, and the rear wing had grown to simply preposterous proportions. An entertaining anecdote from the time suggests that the chief of R&D at BMW remarked that, quote, "The laws of aerodynamics must be different between Munich and Stuttgart, and that, quote, if that rear wing works, we'll have to redesign our wind tunnel." It's been suggested that BMW did in fact redesign their wind tunnel shortly afterwards. Despite the Evo I's less than perfect overall performance, the hype around the Mercedes program meant that it was rumoured all 502 road-going Evo IIs had been sold before they'd even shown the car off at Geneva. And you know what happened next? They took it racing. The 1990 season isn't a fair representation of the Evo II's performance at all, as factory partner AMG didn't get their hands on the new car until round 7. And it wasn't until round 9 at defaults that the new machinery was able to make a real impact, with Kurt Thiem winning the first race of the weekend. Unfortunately for Mercedes, the remaining 2 races were absolutely dominated by Audi's new V8 Quattro, driven by Hans Stuck, who won the championship. It had been a forgettable year for Mercedes. 1991 was the first full competition year for the Evo II, and despite some worries after 1990, it became clear early on that the Evo II was a major upgrade. Klaus Ludwig claimed a double win in round 3 at the Nürburgring, proving the Evo II had the fight in it to battle against BMW and Audi's super competitive machines. This was followed by some podiums and a win for Kurt Thiem at Norrisring Race 1, before Ludwig managed another double win at the Nürburgring in round 8. But much like the previous year, the final couple of rounds were dominated again by the immensely strong Audi V8 Quattro, handing championship victory to Frank Biela despite Ludwig's strong performance. Audi seemed a pretty formidable opponent. 1992 was looking like a do-or-die year for Mercedes. It would be the 7th year they had campaigned some variant of the 190E in DTM, only ever achieving silver. But 91's result had instilled hope in Mercedes, their customer teams, the drivers and the fans alike that maybe, just maybe, they could go for gold. Things started well. Kurt Thiem had moved to Zakspeed to drive one of their 190E Evo IIs, and he won both races in the opening round at Zolder. Roland Asch, in the second Zakspeed Merc, won the second race of round 2 at the Nürburgring. 3 wins in the first 4 races for Zakspeed. Not bad. Round 3 at Wunstorf saw Jörg van Ommen take victory in race 1 for MS Racing's Mercedes outfit before AMG took their first win of the season on Sunday in the hands of Keke Rosberg. Things were getting exciting. Bernd Schneider took victory in race 2 at Avers driving for AMG, then AMG would win again in round 5's first race at Hockenheim in the hands of Ellen Law, who was the first and remains the only woman to have won a DTM championship race. Mighty impressive, but slightly disheartening that she stands alone even 30 years on. Roland Asch would take his second victory for Zakspeed in race 2 that weekend, before Klaus Ludwig would take double victory in round 6 at the Nordschleife. 12 races in, and AMG and Zakspeed were on 5 and 4 wins respectively, all in Mercedes 190E Evo IIs. It looked inevitable one of them would win. Round 7 saw BMW offer some respite from Mercedes' onslaught, and it was also the first race without Audi, who withdrew halfway through the season after scrutineers concluded their new for 92 flat plane crankshaft was illegal. Things were now much closer, and BMW was surely hoping to fight for the title, but the flame of hope was quickly snuffed out, as Klaus Ludwig won both races in round 9, and Bernd Schneider scored another double win in round 10. 4 more wins on the tally for AMG. Schneider won the next race, Ludwig won the following day, and despite a final round to forget with Ludwig failing to finish, the scoresheet had already chosen its winner. Klaus Ludwig, racing for AMG Mercedes, won the 1992 DTM Championship in a 190e 2.5 16 Evo II. That name really does never get any shorter, does it? It marked Mercedes' first DTM win at long last, and a win well earned. 1993 was the final year of competition for the Evo II, where it was beaten, along with all its German compatriots, by the dominant Alfa Romeo 155 Ti V6 of Nicola Larini. DTM's move away from the strict Group A regulations to the freer FIA Class 1 rules meant that newly developed cars, like the Alfa Romeo, were at a significant advantage over cars that had been created for the old rules, taking advantage of the greater freedom to modify their cars more extensively, both mechanically and aerodynamically. For 1994, Mercedes would follow suit, ending 8 years of racing with the 190e. It's 1992. The beastly Mercedes 190e Evo II has just won the DTM Championship after 8 years of trying, failing, and trying again to grab hold of the crown. The championship's Group A regulations have given rise to some of the most famous battles between some of the most famous cars in the world. Cars that you and I might even have seen out on the street, if you're very lucky. But times were changing. DTM was looking to the future, and the future they saw didn't include the Group A formula that had enraptured fans for nearly a decade. They sought to free manufacturers from the shackles of true road homologation. The sun rose on a new era. Class 1. The rule changes proved controversial amongst manufacturers, with BMW calling it quits completely, leaving the E30 M3 in the hands of privateers only, while Opel and Audi developed new cars, despite continuing to and ah about actually committing to the championship. Mercedes, however, stood firm. Their car was great. It had just won the championship. Why make a new car? Well, their answer came quickly. It was a vivid red, made a monstrous sound, and left everybody else coughing in its dust. This is the story of the Alfa Romeo 155 V6 Ti. The new Class 1 rule set introduced for 1993 was a major departure from normalcy for DTM. Since its 1984 inception, the championship had operated under the Group A rules, meaning entrants had to be pretty closely related to a road car people could actually buy. The new Class 1 rules, by comparison, were far more lenient. The rules suggested the car's silhouette should be similar, and some components of the structure and body should be similar, but crucially aerodynamic components and powertrains didn't need to be much like their road-going namesakes at all, and a couple of manufacturers saw this as an opportunity to dethrone the previously dominant forces of Mercedes and Audi if they decided they wanted to compete. I've seen the argument that the 1993 rules weren't really pure Class 1, and instead some people choose to refer to it as Group A+. However, for all practical purposes, this distinction is meaningless. Alfa Romeo was one of the manufacturers looking to try their luck. Alfa have a strong history in motorsport, and indeed a strong brand amongst car enthusiasts. Known for their great looks and their soulfulness, code for poor reliability of course, though in modern times I'm sure this isn't so true, it seemed that a high-profile touring car series like DTM would make a great fit for the company as it sought to bolster its brand. Their new small saloon, named the 155, was clearly aimed at customers who wanted something a bit more interesting than the aging Mercedes 190 and more exotic than a 3 Series. So what better way to convince customers than to have it beat the Germans in their own racing series? Alfa grabbed a 155 and promptly threw most of it away, keeping only what they absolutely had to in order to meet the regulations, which wasn't very much. While you could buy a 155 with all-wheel drive and a 2.5 litre V6, buyers and reviewers were underwhelmed by the car, many bemoaning the fact that there was no real rear-wheel drive configuration. Front-wheel drive or four-wheel drive were your options. This was of little bother to the engineers working on the race car, however, as the only rule really standing in their way was the engine regulations. I won't bore you too much. In a nutshell, manufacturers were limited to 6 cylinders, 2.5 litres of displacement, and the engine block had to be made out of the same material as the car's road-going counterpart. Happily, beyond this, they could do pretty much whatever they liked. So a quick valve count will reveal that the race car had double that of the road car and a new aluminium cylinder head. The 24-valve, naturally aspirated racing engine put out a substantial 420 horsepower, and paired with an all-wheel drive system, the 155 V6 Ti was looking on paper to be formidable. So that's the V6 part of its name dealt with, but what does Ti mean? Turismo Internazionale, which translates to international touring, and international it certainly was. Many were skeptical that the Italian outsider would really be able to compete against its super heavyweight German rivals, but Alfa weren't invited just to make up the numbers, they were in it to win it. The championship-winning 190e 2.516V Evo II that Mercedes carried forward into 1993 weighed a substantial 1,340 kilograms. Alfa, not constrained by Group A homologation requirements, made a vaguely 155 shaped body out of mostly carbon fibre, bringing their car down to a dry weight of just 1,040 kilos. Mercedes may have miscalculated how urgently they required a proper Class 1 car. Okay, so Alfa had a car that weighed less, had more power, and had all-wheel drive. How could they possibly lose? Well, to save you the surprise, they didn't. Alfa Romeo's factory team, Alfa Corsa, entered 2 cars. One would be driven by Alessandro Nannini and the other by Nicola Larini. A couple of privateer teams got their hands on the car too, but we can safely forget about that for the time being. Things started out well for the Italian hopefuls, with Larini scoring a double win in the rainy opening round at Zolder. A privateer 155 in the hands of Christian Danner took second place here too, in both races. Four-wheel drive had immediately proven its worth. In case you're unsure what I mean by double win or both races, DTM, at least in this iteration of the championship, ran 2 races per weekend at the same track, differentiating it from the norm. Keeping in mind that each weekend hosted 2 races will help the results make more sense as we move forward. Mercedes, being the only other factory entrant into the season that year, at least from the start, realised fast their old car was too old. They couldn't rustle up a brand new car overnight, but they could certainly take a blowtorch to the one they already had, so that's what they did. Now, I hate to break the flow of the story, but this is important. I can't find a source that says exactly what race Mercedes implemented the changes, but for the season overall, both AMG Mercedes and Zakspeed ran both the 190e Evo II and the so-called 190e Class 1, but when they made the switch, I can't be certain. I will from now on refer to the Mercedes as simply the 190. Also, while we're having this quick aside, there was more than just Alfas and Mercs on the track, but all the others were privateer entries, at least until race 10. You with me? Good. Let's move on. Actually, just one more thing. If you want to support Automobilistic, consider becoming a channel member. I love making these videos, and if you enjoy watching them and can afford to do so, consider tapping the join button below this video to support the channel. You'll get access to members only channels in my Discord server, which is linked below, as well as occasional exclusive content. A huge thank you to my existing members, and now back to the video. Bernd Schneider in a Mercedes 190 wasn't going to go down without a fight and managed a mighty double victory in round 2 at Hockenheim, relegating the Alfas to 8th and 9th in race 1 and a much closer but still not victorious 2nd and 6th in round 2. Larini won round 3's first race at the Nürburgring but retired from race 2 with an engine failure, handing victory to DTM champion Klaus Ludwig driving for Mercedes AMG. This was repeated at Wunstorf, where Larini won the first race but retired from the second, this time running out of fuel.
I don't know exactly what happened.
Kurt Thiem, racing for Zakspeed's outfit, took victory in the second race in a 190. Alfa Romeo were doing well, there's no doubt, but we'd been promised domination. Even taking full advantage of the new rules, would Alfa really be able to upstage the Germans at their own game? Round 5 at the Nürburgring saw Larini take back the top spot in both races, followed by another double victory in round 6 at Norrisring, then another win at Donington Park race 2, where his teammate Danner had won the first race, though this round didn't count towards DTM Championship points for some reason. At Diepholz, Roland Asch in his Mercedes won the opening race, briefly interrupting Alfa's run, before Larini mounted a memorable recovery to take victory in race 2, helped by some rain that brought out the best in the four-wheel drive 155. By this point, it was pretty clear that Larini was likely to take the 1993 championship, a feat that was, in hindsight, pretty much a guarantee from the beginning, given the lack of substantive opposition. Larini won the first race at Singen, conceding the next 3 races to Mercedes, before his Alfa Corsa teammate Nannini won the final 2 races at Hockenheim. It had truly been Alfa Romeo's year, with Alfa Corsa driver Nicola Larini taking a well-deserved championship victory for the team, the only team to have a car truly made for the rules, and willing to take full advantage of that fact to get one over on the Germans. But how would the 155 Ti fare the following year? The short answer is not exceptionally well. Don't get me wrong, Alfa and Larini were still plenty competitive, but with Mercedes creating a new proper Class 1 car for 1994 and Opel entering the fray too with their own four-wheel drive machine, the opportunities for domination dried up for Alfa Romeo. They weren't exactly complacent. The 1994 155 Ti had some significant upgrades over the 1993 car, most notably in its suspension and braking system, but the leap made by Mercedes proved too big. Larini managed to grab 3rd place in the 1994 championship overall, losing to a dominant performance by Klaus Ludwig for Mercedes AMG and a slightly less dominant but still better than everyone else performance by Jörg van Ommen for Zakspeed. 1995 saw Larini and Alfa Romeo by proxy fall down the order even further, managing just 6th place in the championship overall, a fall from grace for the Italian team. In 1996, DTM rebranded, becoming the more international ITC, which stood for International Touring Cars. This saw races in places so far afield as France and Italy, even venturing to Finland for round 4. Despite Alfa Romeo changing their engine partway through the season to a PRV-derived unit, away from the Busso that they had been using since 1993, the results refused to swing their way consistently enough for the championship to be within grasp. Alessandro Nannini was Alfa's man that year, with Larini posting a very disappointing 11th place championship finish, but Nannini still only managed 3rd. The problems were bigger than that though. The internationalization of DTM, along with the supposedly freer and less restrictive rules, had seen the cost to compete soar. At the end of 1996, Alfa Romeo and Opel withdrew from the competition. As they together represented 2/3 of the competing factory teams, the championship folded. The 155 V6 Ti may not have achieved the heights that Alfa Romeo had hoped for, and it could easily be argued that the season that it did win wasn't exactly on merit alone, but I'm going to defend them here. If Alfa Romeo could sort out a Class 1 car for 1993, they shouldn't have their achievement taken away from them on the grounds that nobody else could get their act together fast enough. Would they have lost to a full Class 1 effort from Mercedes? Probably, but it doesn't matter. Mercedes was slow, Alfa was not. And let's not forget, maybe the most important point of all, the 155 V6 Ti looked awesome. Ultimately it served Alfa's goal. There's no doubt in my mind that the perception and legacy of the, at first underwhelming, road-going 155 was hugely boosted by their success in DTM. Even if in reality the cars only shared a name and a shape, they became cool by association. Group A DTM was peak touring car racing. Even at the height of the championship's popularity, it remained unpolished, much to the dismay of organisers, and to me it represents so much of what I love about motorsport. The cars may not have been the fastest in the world, but some of the drivers certainly were, and what exciting racing it was. Touring car racing is still great. I don't want this to be a back in the good old days type whinge, but there was something special about early DTM. The cars it spawned via its homologation requirements changed the culture of cars significantly, highlighted by the often crazy prices collectors are willing to pay for cars like the 190e Evo II. DTM wasn't perfect. It was controversial, sometimes unfair, and didn't help itself by becoming ever more convoluted. But you're here now, 40 years later, listening to me, a person born long after DTM's Group A era ended, talking about it. That counts for something. The 155's 1993 season victory had marked the end of DTM's illustrious Group A era. Alfa's story is an important capstone to this story, but also marked the beginning of another. If you want to hear all the stories of DTM's Class 1 era, leave a like and comment down below to let me know. I hope you enjoyed this video. A big thank you to my wonderful channel members for supporting Automobilistic. It means the world. Thank you for watching, and until next time, goodbye.